Hello everybody, my name is Todd Barty and I'm a drama teacher, actor, director and playwright, and I'm here to tell you about one of my very favourite styles of theatre, the Commedia Dell'Arte. It's an Italian style of theatre that got its start early in the 16th century, and it has two defining characteristics. It's improvised, there are no scripts, and most of the characters wore masks, just like these. Now, first of all, I'll start with a bit of history. When I say that the Commedia dell'arte began in the early 16th century, that's when it crystallised into the form that we know as Commedia dell'arte today. However, elements of Commedia dell'arte had been around before that. Certain characters, and there were antecedents like acrobatic performances, masked performances, improvisations that were going on in markets and squares to celebrate the coming of May, and even antecedents ran as far back as the ancient Roman farces of Plautus and Terence, which were, in the early 16th century, enjoying a revival thanks to another style called the Commedia erudita, or the Comedy of Scholars, which was an amateur form performed by students. But early in the 16th century, these various disparate influences came together, and actors came together to form troupes where they could organise to perform as a profession in a serious way. In a way, it was the first kind of actors' unionism. And these troupes were able to arrange locations to perform, to seek permission from civic authorities so they knew that they would have a place when they got to the town, because they travelled. They travelled around on carts. And there's a kind of misnomer that Commedia dell'arte was always performed on the back of these carts in squares or piazzas. It's not true. Commedia troupes would get into the best venues that were available to them. If they could get into a theatre, they would. If they were invited to court, which a lot of the most famous companies were, to a royal court, well, that was fantastic. They wanted to be in the best place possible, and so they toured around to make money. And as they toured, the influence of the Commedia dell'arte spread across Europe. France developed its own distinctive form of Commedia dell'arte with characters like the Pierrot clown, the sad clown that's kind of iconic. Now, even though Commedia dell'arte was improvised in its purest form, from the very earliest days of Commedia dell'arte, there were playwrights who wanted to write it down as a script. An early form of theatre, starting in the 16th century, I believe, was the theatre of the ridiculous, which used Commedia dell'arte characters and plot lines in scripted comedies. The first, and perhaps the first big fish playwright who we remember and know today, who's a household name, who wrote comedy based on the Commedia dell'arte, was William Shakespeare. Because the Commedia dell'arte travelled to England, and he would have surely seen it. And you can see the influence of the kind of master-servant relationships, the pranks and trickery from servants and lower status characters, the convoluted plots that lovers go through in order to come together finally in Shakespeare's plays. All of that was there in the Commedia dell'arte already. One of France's national playwrights, Molière, actually travelled and performed with a Commedia dell'arte troupe, and you can see that influence in his plays. Some of his plays even contain characters that were directly from the Commedia dell'arte, using the names they had in the Commedia dell'arte, or at least the French version of it. In Italy, in the 18th century, there were the playwrights Carlo Goldoni and Carlo Gozzi. Carlo Goldoni and Carlo Gozzi had a rivalry. Goldoni, who actually gave the Commedia dell'arte its name, Commedia dell'arte, didn't like it. Before he gave it its name, it had been called Commedia all improviso, or Commedia Zanesca, after the characters of Zani, who were quite important. He didn't like the fact it was improvised, though, and he didn't like the fact that it was masked. He sought to reform it by writing scripts for it, and he didn't want his plays to be performed with masks, although they sneakily sometimes are when we see them nowadays. Gozzi, on the other hand, was a rival to Goldoni, and he loved the Commedia dell'Arte as it was, and he sought to preserve it. Goldoni wrote plays like The Servant of Two Masters. Gozzi wrote plays like Turandot, both of which have become operas ever since. And so we can see that Commedia dell'Arte has been preserved. In the 18th and 19th century, it moved into the pantomimes in France and in England. French, used mime tradition to bring some of the characters to life. Characters like Pierrot were often performed in mime. In England, they formed what were called Italian night scenes, using English versions of the Commedia dell'Arte, like Harlequin and Columbine and Pantaloon, and even the better known English clown had its origins in English Commedia dell'Arte. These Italian night scenes became the beginning of what we now know as British pantomime, the over-the-top fairy tale stories, because at the end of them they would have a small fairy tale sequence. Gradually the fairy tale sequence grew, and the Commedia sequence became a bit at the beginning called the Harlequinade, which was eventually dropped off altogether. And you can see the influence of Commedia dell'Arte archetypes even into contemporary sitcoms. So it has had immense lasting influence on world theatre. Now, a point to note about improvisation before we go any further. Improvisation wasn't simply off the cuff. The actors didn't simply make up the stories entirely as they went along. They had an outline that was called a scenario that said what was going to happen in this play and detailed major plot points. Earlier it was called the Canavaccio because it was on the back of the canvas that made up the set. It was written there so actors could see before they went onto stage where they were up to in the plot, what points they needed to cover while they were out there, and then they would go out there and they would improvise that plot. They would improvise the dialogue, but they were helped by these things called lazzi. Now, lazzi were bits that had been rehearsed. They were physical or verbal gags, sometimes with just one character, sometimes between several characters, and they could be inserted at any point in the plot, or at a convenient point in the plot, rather. And there was also burla, which was a kind of gag that could be used to bridge the gap between scenes and drawn out if necessary.